You think you're crazy sometimes, don't you? Not because anything is actually wrong with your mind, because someone in your life has a very particular way of responding to you that leaves you standing there blinking, wondering if you really did overreact, if you really are too sensitive, if the thing you just watched happen with your own eyes actually happened the way you think it did. Maybe it's a partner, maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a boss who somehow always manages to make every mistake feel like it was your fault, even the ones that clearly weren't. And the strangest part isn't the confusion itself. The strangest part is how normal it started to feel, how you've quietly built your whole way of communicating around trying to prevent a reaction you can't even fully predict. That feeling has a name. It's not weakness, and it's not a personality flaw. It's the fingerprint of something psychologists have studied for decades, something with a specific mechanism, specific patterns, and specific reasons it works so well on exactly the kind of person you probably are. Because here's the first uncomfortable truth: manipulation doesn't usually target weak people. It targets empathetic ones. It targets people who assume good intent, who question themselves before they question others, who would rather carry the blame than risk being unfair. If that description stings a little, keep listening, because understanding why it works is the first step toward it never working on you again. Let's start with something that sounds almost too simple to matter, and yet it's the foundation of almost every manipulative dynamic that has ever existed. Manipulation isn't primarily about lying. It's about rewriting reality in real time and getting you to agree to the rewrite. Think about the last time you brought up something that hurt you, and somehow, by the end of the conversation, you were the one apologizing. That's not an accident. That's a specific move psychologists sometimes call reality substitution. The manipulator doesn't need to convince you that the event didn't happen. They only need to convince you that your interpretation of it was wrong, unfair, dramatic, or somehow proof of your own issues. And the moment you accept that substitution, even just a little, you've handed over something enormous. You've handed over your own authority to interpret your own life. Here's where it gets interesting, because this is the part almost nobody explains properly. This substitution works because of something your brain does automatically, something that has nothing to do with intelligence or self-awareness. Human beings are wired to reduce internal conflict. When two things we believe can't both be true at the same time, our minds don't sit comfortably in that tension. They resolve it fast, usually by adjusting the belief that feels most flexible. And in a relationship with a manipulator, the belief that feels most flexible is almost always your own perception, because they will defend their version with a confidence that looks, on the surface, indistinguishable from truth. This is why smart, self-aware, emotionally mature people still get pulled into these dynamics. It was never about intelligence. It was about a nervous system doing exactly what nervous systems are built to do: resolve discomfort as efficiently as possible, and a manipulator learning, whether consciously or not, exactly which lever to pull to make that resolution favor them. There's a specific nervous system response worth naming here, because most people have heard of fight, flight, and freeze, but almost nobody has heard of the fourth response, the one most closely tied to manipulation. It's called fawning, and it looks nothing like the dramatic reactions the other three names suggest. Fawning is the instinct to appease, to soften, to make yourself smaller and more agreeable the moment you sense danger, not because you're weak, but because somewhere earlier in your life, appeasement was the strategy that actually worked. A child who learns that calming an unpredictable parent is safer than confronting them carries that exact strategy into every future relationship where the emotional temperature suddenly rises. The body doesn't distinguish between the original danger and the new one. It simply recognizes the pattern and reaches for the tool that kept it safe before. This matters enormously because it explains something that confuses almost everyone caught in these dynamics. Why, in the middle of an argument where you are clearly the one being treated unfairly, do Do you feel the overwhelming urge to apologize, to soothe, to fix the other person's mood before addressing your own? That urge isn't confusion about who's right. It's your nervous system running a program that was built for survival long before this particular relationship existed, and it will keep running that program automatically until you consciously teach your body a different response is now safe to use. Now here's a twist that changes how you'll see every manipulative relationship you've ever been in. Most people picture manipulators as cold, calculating masterminds sitting somewhere plotting their next move. That's rare. Far more common and far more dangerous because it's harder to spot is the manipulator who genuinely believes their own distorted version of events in the moment they're saying it. They're not always lying to you. Sometimes they're lying to themselves first, and you're simply the audience for a performance they've already convinced themselves is true. This matters because it explains why confronting them with facts so rarely works. You're not up against dishonesty. You're up against a self-protective narrative that's had years to harden into something that feels to them indistinguishable from memory. So if logic doesn't break the pattern, what does? Before we get there, you need to understand one more piece of the puzzle, because this is the part that keeps people stuck for years instead of months. There's a reason people don't leave these dynamics the moment they notice something is wrong. It's the same reason a gambler stays at a slot machine that mostly loses. Psychologists call it intermittent reinforcement, and it is, without exaggeration, one of the most powerful behavioral forces ever documented. If someone treated you badly all the time, you would leave. The human mind is actually quite good at recognizing consistent mistreatment and building distance from it. What keeps people trapped isn't consistency, it's unpredictability, the warmth that shows up right when you're about to give up, the apology that feels so sincere it erases 6 months of doubt in a single conversation, the version of them that reminds you exactly why you fell for them in the first place, appearing just often enough to keep the hope alive, just rarely enough to keep you chasing it. Your brain doesn't file this as a red flag. It files it as a jackpot, and jackpots, even rare ones, are exactly what keep people pulling the same lever long after logic would tell them to walk away. This is why willpower alone rarely works here. You are not fighting a lack of discipline. You're fighting a reward system that has been quietly trained, repetition by repetition, to associate unpredictability with intimacy itself, which means the way out isn't simply trying harder to leave. It's understanding the mechanism well enough that the pattern stops having power over you the moment you see it clearly. There's a name for what forms when this cycle runs long enough, and hearing it named out loud is often the moment people finally stop blaming themselves for staying as long as they did. It's called a trauma bond, and despite how clinical that phrase sounds, the experience of it is almost tender in a way that makes it even harder to escape. A trauma bond forms specifically because the highs and lows are happening inside the same relationship, often within the same week, sometimes within the same day. The person who caused the pain is also the person who provides the relief from it, which creates an attachment far stronger and far more confusing than either kindness or cruelty could produce on its own. You don't just miss them when it ends. You miss the specific relief only they seemed able to provide, conveniently forgetting that they were also the primary source of the pain that relief was curing. This is why people leaving these relationships often describe withdrawal in language almost identical to substance withdrawal: restlessness, obsessive thinking, a physical ache that logic can't seem to touch. That's not an exaggeration or a metaphor stretched too far. The same neurochemical systems involved in substance dependency are deeply involved in trauma bonding, which is precisely why simply knowing the relationship is unhealthy so rarely translates into feeling ready to leave it. Understanding wins the argument in your head. It doesn't automatically calm the body that has been trained for months or years to treat this particular unpredictability as the thing keeping it alive. Before we go further, it's worth understanding where this cycle usually begins, because almost nobody meets a manipulator and immediately feels manipulated. They meet someone who feels, for a while, like the best thing that has ever happened to them. Psychologists sometimes describe this opening phase as love bombing. though the term applies just as easily outside romance, to friendships, to mentors, to certain bosses who make you feel like the most promising hire they've had in years. The pattern is the same no matter the relationship. Attention arrives in a flood. You are seen, praised, understood in a way that feels almost impossibly fast. Compliments land exactly where you're most insecure. Plans move quickly. Trust is asked for early and given because the intensity feels like proof of something real rather than a warning sign. Here's why this opening phase matters so much later. It sets a reference point. Once you've experienced someone at their most attentive, most generous, most emotionally available, that version becomes the baseline you keep measuring against, even after the flood recedes and the person underneath it turns out to behave very differently. You're not comparing their current behavior to what's reasonable. You're comparing it to the best version you've already seen with your own eyes, and that comparison keeps hope alive long after hope has stopped being useful. This is one of the cruelest parts of the entire pattern. The very thing that made you trust them so quickly is the same thing that makes it so hard to leave later, because some part of you keeps insisting that the person capable of that opening chapter must still be in there, somewhere waiting to come back. Let's talk about one specific tactic, because once you learn to recognize it, you will start seeing it everywhere, in relationships, in families, even in workplaces, and you will never be able to unsee it again. It's called DARVO, deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. It sounds technical, but the experience of it is painfully familiar. You bring up something that hurts you. Instead of acknowledgement, you get denial. The moment denial doesn't work, you get an attack, often something completely unrelated, designed to shift the emotional center of gravity away from what you said. And then, almost seamlessly, the roles flip. Somehow, within minutes, you're the one who's cruel, unreasonable, controlling, or ungrateful, and they're the one who's hurt. If you've ever walked away from a conversation feeling like you started as the person who was wronged and somehow ended it as the person who owes an apology, you've experienced this firsthand. And here's what makes it so effective. It doesn't require premeditation. Many people who do this aren't running a calculated strategy. They're running an old defense mechanism, one built in childhood, one that fires automatically the instant they feel exposed. Understanding that doesn't excuse the behavior, but it does explain why reasoning with someone mid-pattern almost never works. You're not negotiating with their intent, you're colliding with their defense system. And defense systems don't listen, they only react. Picture how this actually plays out, because the abstract version rarely lands the way the lived version does. You mentioned that you felt dismissed when they canceled plans again without much explanation. The first response is denial, delivered with genuine-sounding confusion that never happened. You're remembering it wrong. I always explain myself. When you hold your ground and describe the specific moment, the conversation pivots, seemingly out of nowhere, into an old grievance, something you did 3 months ago that was never fully resolved, dragged into the present with startling emotional intensity. By the time that detour runs its course, the original complaint has vanished entirely, replaced by a much larger argument about your character, your patterns, your tendency to bring up the past until somehow you're the one softening your tone, offering reassurance, working to repair a rupture that started with your own valid, small, completely reasonable observation. That's the entire arc. Denial, attack, reversal. And it can happen in under 3 minutes, which is exactly why it's so disorienting to recognize in the moment rather than afterward, replaying it in your head at 2 in the morning. There's a companion pattern to DARVO that deserves its own attention because it hides in plain sight even more effectively. It's called projection, and most people think they understand it, but the actual mechanism is subtler than the popular version. Projection isn't simply accusing you of the thing they're doing. It's a genuine psychological process where a person, unable to tolerate an uncomfortable truth about themselves, unconsciously relocates that truth onto you instead. The accusation feels sincere to them because, in a distorted way, it is sincere. They are describing something real. They've simply misassigned the source. This is why the accusations in these dynamics often feel eerily specific, oddly detailed, almost too precise to be random. That precision isn't a coincidence. It's usually a direct reflection of exactly what's happening inside the accuser, described with the accuracy of first-hand experience, aimed outward instead of inward. Recognizing this pattern doesn't require you to diagnose anyone. It only requires you to notice a simple, testable question. Every time an accusation lands, does the evidence in my actual behavior support this? Or does this description fit someone else's behavior suspiciously well? There's a reason this particular question is so effective, and it has to do with timing rather than content. Manipulative accusations tend to arrive fastest and land hardest in the exact moment you've raised a concern of your own, almost as if the accusation exists specifically to interrupt the momentum of what you were saying. If you notice that pattern, that accusations reliably surface right when you're mid-sentence about something that actually bothered you, that timing alone is worth paying attention to, independent of whether the accusation itself contains any truth. Real concerns, the kind a caring person raises out of genuine reflection, don't usually arrive as an emergency interruption to someone else's valid point. They tend to arrive on their own schedule, in their own separate conversation, not as a rescue flare set off the instant the spotlight shifts away. Now let's widen the lens beyond romantic relationships, because manipulation rarely stays confined to one category of relationship in a person's life. It shows up at work with uncomfortable frequency, and it's often mistaken for ordinary office politics because the stakes feel smaller and the relationship feels less personal. But the mechanism is identical. A manager who takes credit for your work while subtly implying in front of others that you struggle with follow-through. A colleague who agrees to a plan in private and then, in the meeting, acts confused about why you did what you did, letting the room draw its own unflattering conclusions. A boss who praises you privately and criticizes you publicly, creating exactly enough doubt that you start questioning your own competence instead of questioning the pattern. Workplace manipulation is often more dangerous in one specific way. It comes wrapped in professional language, which makes it feel objective even when it isn't. Feedback framed as concern, criticism framed as mentorship, exclusion framed as a scheduling issue. The vocabulary of professionalism becomes a kind of camouflage, letting the same reality substitution and reversal tactics operate under cover of something that sounds reasonable on paper. If you've ever left a performance review feeling smaller than the actual content of the conversation should have made you feel, this is often why. The tone did more work than the facts did, and tone is exactly the kind of thing that's almost impossible to point to later as evidence. There's a specific workplace pattern worth naming directly because it's so common and so rarely called what it actually is. It's sometimes described as the competence trap. You do excellent work, quietly, consistently, without much need for supervision. Over time, that reliability gets quietly reclassified, not as a strength to be rewarded, but as a resource to be maximized. More gets added to your plate, not because anyone has evaluated whether it's fair, but because you are the person least likely to complain about the addition. When you finally do raise a concern about workload, the response often isn't correction. It's a subtle reframing of your concern as evidence that you're struggling to keep up, which is precisely the opposite of what prompted the extra work in the first place. This isn't always calculated cruelty from a manager. Sometimes it's simply an organization defaulting to the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance is almost always the person who has spent years demonstrating they will absorb more without pushing back. Family systems carry their own version of this, often the oldest and most deeply rooted, because these patterns frequently started before you had any language to describe them. A parent who only expresses pride in front of other people, never directly to you. A sibling dynamic where you were cast, early and permanently, as the dramatic one, the sensitive one, the difficult one, a label that now gets used to dismiss any concern you raise, regardless of its actual merit. Family manipulation is uniquely sticky because because it doesn't rely on new tactics. It relies on decades of accumulated precedent, an entire shared history that the manipulator can selectively reference to make their version of events feel like the only version that's ever been true. This is worth naming clearly because it explains something that confuses a lot of people. Why does the same manipulative comment from a stranger roll off you completely, while an almost identical comment from a parent or sibling can undo you for days? It's not about the words, it's about the weight of repetition behind them. A stranger's opinion carries no history. A family member's opinion carries the accumulated force of every similar comment you've absorbed since childhood, each one reinforcing the belief the current comment is simply reactivating. You're not just responding to one sentence, you're responding to a lifetime of sentences shaped like it. This also explains why family gatherings can feel so uniquely draining even when nothing overtly dramatic happens during them. You're not just attending a dinner. Some part of you is quietly bracing for old dynamics to resurface, monitoring tone, monitoring seating arrangements, monitoring who brings up what, running a background process that has nothing to do with the actual conversation happening at the table, and everything to do with years of pattern recognition operating just beneath conscious awareness. That exhaustion afterward isn't a sign that you're too sensitive for your own family. It's the natural cost of a nervous system doing complicated, mostly invisible work the entire time you were simply trying to eat a meal. So here's the real question, the one worth sitting with for a moment before we go further. If logic doesn't work, and leaving isn't simple, and confrontation often backfires, what actually does create change? The answer starts somewhere most people don't expect. It doesn't start with them. It starts with rebuilding something inside you that this dynamic has slowly worn down, your trust in your own perception. This is the real target of almost every manipulative pattern, whether the person doing it realizes it or not. Not your compliance, not even your affection, your certainty. Because a person who fully trusts their own read of a situation is remarkably hard to manipulate. Doubt is the door. Once that door is open, everything else becomes possible. This is why the most powerful tool against manipulation isn't a clever comeback or a perfectly worded confrontation. It's documentation in the loosest sense of the word. Not evidence for a court case, evidence for yourself, writing down what actually happened, in your own words, close to the moment it happened, before anyone has a chance to talk you out of your own memory of it. People who do this consistently describe the same experience. The fog lifts. Patterns that felt vague and impossible to name suddenly become undeniable when you see 5 or 6 of them lined up on a page, written in your own hand, in your own voice, before it got rewritten by someone else's version of events. This practice works for a reason that has almost nothing to do with proving anything to anyone else. Memory, especially emotional memory, is remarkably easy to distort after the fact, and a manipulator's counter-narrative acts almost like a solvent on the details, softening edges, blurring sequences, until a clear memory from Tuesday feels murky and uncertain by Friday. A written account, made close to the actual event, freezes the memory before the solvent has time to work. Reading it back later, sometimes weeks or months later, often produces a strange, almost clarifying shock, the realization that you weren't exaggerating anything, that if anything you'd been softening the account, even as you wrote it, because some old habit of minimizing was still operating even in a notebook no one else would ever read. There's a second thing that matters just as much, and it's uncomfortable to hear because it asks something of you rather than something of them. You have to become willing to let someone be upset with you. Read that again, because it's the hinge this entire pattern swings on. Manipulation thrives specifically on your discomfort with someone else's disappointment, frustration, or anger. The moment you can tolerate that discomfort without immediately trying to fix it, apologize for it, or manage it away, the entire mechanism loses its grip. Not because the other person changes, because you stop being the kind of audience their pattern was built to perform for. This is harder than it sounds, because most people who end up in these dynamics were taught somewhere along the way that other people's negative emotions are their responsibility to prevent. That belief, formed early, usually with good intentions behind it, is exactly what makes someone so easy to pull into into a manipulative rhythm later in life. Unwinding it doesn't happen through a single bold conversation. It happens through dozens of small moments where you let a silence sit, let a disappointment exist, let someone be upset with you without rushing in to smooth it over, and notice, slowly, that the world does not end. There's a specific technique worth understanding here, one that therapists sometimes teach to people recovering from these dynamics, and it sounds almost too plain to work until you actually try it. It's the practice of the broken record, responding to an escalating argument not with new justifications or new evidence, but with the same calm, short statement repeated without embellishment. I understand you see it differently. I'm not going to keep discussing this tonight. I hear that you're upset, and I still need this. The power of this technique isn't in the words themselves. It's in what it refuses to offer. Manipulative escalation depends on new material to twist, new explanations to reinterpret, new emotional openings to exploit. A calm, unchanging response starves that process of fuel. There's nothing new to distort, which means the usual moves simply have nothing to grip onto. Here's something that will change how you see every future relationship you build, romantic or otherwise. Healthy people, when you set a limit, might feel friction for a moment, but they adjust. Manipulative dynamics don't adjust. They escalate. That difference, watched closely over time, rather than judged from a single interaction, tells you almost everything you need to know about whether a relationship can actually change or whether you're negotiating with a pattern that has no real interest in negotiation at all. This escalation often follows a recognizable arc, and knowing the arc in advance takes away much of its power to surprise you. First comes confusion, a sincere sounding, "Why are you being like this?" If that doesn't work, it shifts into minor concession, a small acknowledgement offered just convincingly enough to make you doubt whether the boundary was even necessary. If the boundary still holds, the tone often shifts into something colder, distance, silence, a subtle withdrawal of the warmth you've come to associate with things being okay between you. This is frequently the hardest stage to sit through, because the silence itself starts to feel like punishment, and the instinct to break it, to apologize just to restore the familiar warmth, can be almost overwhelming. Recognizing this stage as a stage, rather than as evidence that you've done something wrong, is often the single most useful thing you can carry into these situations. There's a fourth stage that shows up less often, but matters enormously when it does, because it tends to catch people off guard even after they've learned to recognize the earlier three. It's the sudden, generous concession, the moment the manipulator appears to fully agree with you, apologizes more thoroughly than they ever have before, and seems briefly like they've finally understood. This stage can feel like victory, and sometimes it genuinely is the beginning of real change. But it's worth watching closely rather than immediately relaxing into relief, because for some people this concession functions less as growth and more as a reset button, a way of restoring your trust just enough that the same pattern can quietly begin again a few weeks later this time, starting from a position of renewed goodwill. The way to tell the difference isn't the sincerity of the apology in the moment. It's whether the actual behavior changes in the weeks that follow, whether the same trigger produces the same old response the next time it comes up, or whether something genuinely different has taken its place. It's worth pausing here to address something that gets overlooked in most conversations about this topic because it can feel almost taboo to say out loud. Not everyone who manipulates is doing so with full awareness or full malice. Some people learned these patterns the same way you may have learned to over-apologize or over-accommodate as survival strategies built in environments where directness wasn't safe or wasn't modeled. This doesn't make the impact on you any less real, and it doesn't obligate you to stay in a dynamic that's harming you while someone else works through their own history. But understanding that manipulation often comes from an unhealed place rather than a purely calculated one can shift how you carry the aftermath. It lets you hold two things at once. This behavior was not okay, and this person is not necessarily a monster. Both of those things can be true, and holding both is often what finally allows people to make clear decisions instead of decisions clouded by either excessive guilt or excessive rage. There's also a specific kind of manipulation that doesn't rely on conflict at all, and it's worth naming because it's often mistaken for closeness rather than control. It's called isolation, and it rarely looks dramatic in the moment it happens. It looks like a slight discouragement every time you mention spending time with friends, a subtle unease that surfaces whenever a family member offers you a different perspective than the one you've been given at home, a pattern where every outside relationship in your life somehow gets quietly reframed as less trustworthy, less understanding, less on your side than the person doing the reframing. The goal, whether conscious or not, is to become your primary and eventually your only source of interpretation for what's normal. Once that happens, there's no external voice left to compare notes with, no one to say, "Wait, that doesn't sound right," and the manipulator's version of reality becomes the only version available to check yourself against. This is precisely why reconnecting with outside perspectives, even in small, low-stakes ways, is one of the most protective things you can do inside any relationship that feels confusing. Not to build a case against anyone, but simply to remember what an outside voice sounds like, to remember that your read of a situation can be checked against someone who has no investment in you doubting it. People recovering from long manipulative dynamics often describe this reconnection as strange at first, almost disorienting, the way sunlight feels too bright after a long time indoors. That disorientation fades quickly, and what usually replaces it is relief, the specific relief of realizing you were not, in fact, imagining any of it. There's one more practical tool worth understanding, because it tends to help specifically in situations where full distance isn't immediately possible. A co-parenting relationship, a family member you can't simply remove from your life, a boss you can't quit tomorrow. It's sometimes called the gray rock method, and the name captures the idea well enough. It means becoming deliberately uninteresting, not cold or hostile, simply neutral, brief, and low in emotional content. Manipulation, in almost every form we've discussed, feeds on reaction. It needs your visible hurt, your visible anger, your visible confusion to have anything to work with. A person who responds to provocation with short, flat, factual answers without volunteering emotional material, without defending themselves at length, without offering the kind of vivid reaction that gives a manipulator something to twist, often finds that the provocations themselves start to lose momentum over time, not because the other person has had a change of heart, but because the fuel supply has quietly been cut off. This isn't a permanent way to live, and it isn't meant to be. It's a specific tool for specific situations, a way to reduce harm while other changes, bigger changes, become possible. Using it doesn't mean becoming a different person forever. It means understanding clearly that your emotional expressiveness, which is one of your best qualities in healthy relationships, is exactly the resource a manipulative dynamic is drawing from, and choosing, temporarily and strategically, to stop supplying it. And this brings us to the realization that actually matters more than any tactic, any definition, any clever label for a manipulative behavior. The goal was never to become someone who can spot every manipulative move in real time, cataloging tactics like a detective. That's exhausting, and it turns every relationship into a courtroom. The real goal is quieter and far more powerful. It's becoming someone whose sense of reality doesn't depend on anyone else's approval of it. Someone who can say calmly, "This happened, this is how it made me feel," and let that statement stand on its own, without needing it to be negotiated, debated, or agreed upon by the very person who benefits from you doubting it. There's a final layer to this worth sitting with, because it's the part that determines whether any of this actually sticks once the immediate situation calms down. Recovering your trust in your own perception isn't a single decision. It's a rebuilt habit, and habits are built through repetition, not insight alone. This means there will be moments even after everything you've just heard lands clearly where an old doubt creeps back in, where you catch yourself halfway through an apology you don't actually owe, where a familiar warmth from the person who hurt you makes the whole pattern feel briefly convincingly like it might have been an exaggeration after all. That moment doesn't mean you failed to learn any of this. It means you're human, and old grooves take time to fill in with new ones. The difference this time is that you'll notice it happening. You'll feel the pull and recognize it its shape, and recognition, even mid-pull, is something you didn't have before. It's worth talking honestly about what actually happens in the months after someone finally steps back from a long manipulative dynamic, because the popular version of this story tends to skip straight to relief, and relief is real, but it isn't the whole picture. Many people describe an unexpected wave of grief arriving first, grief for the relationship they thought they were in, grief for the time spent doubting themselves, sometimes even grief for the version of the manipulator that only ever existed in those early intense love-bombing months. Missing someone who hurt you doesn't mean the decision to create distance was wrong. It means attachment doesn't disappear the moment clarity arrives. The two can and often do exist together for a while, clarity about what happened and grief about what it cost, running side by side until one gradually outweighs the other. There's also often an unexpected disorientation around simple decisions: what to eat, what to wear, what to think about a piece of news that used to route automatically through the manipulator's reaction before you'd even fully registered your own. That habit of checking, of pre-negotiating your own opinions against someone else's likely response, doesn't vanish the day the relationship ends. It fades slowly through hundreds of small moments of noticing you made a choice entirely on your own, and the world didn't end the same way any other reflex fades once it stops being reinforced. People who move through this well tend to treat this phase with patience rather than frustration, understanding that a nervous system trained over years to anticipate someone else's reactions needs more than a few weeks to fully retrain itself towards simply trusting its own. Because here's the thing nobody tells you at the start of all this: you were never the problem for noticing. You were never too sensitive for feeling something was wrong before you could explain why. That instinct, the quiet unease you tried so hard to talk yourself out of, was never the flaw. It was the most accurate instrument you had, and the entire dynamic only survived as long as it did because you were taught, slowly and convincingly, to stop trusting it. There's a strange kind of freedom waiting on the other side of this understanding, one that has nothing to do with winning an argument or being finally, publicly proven right. It's the freedom of no longer needing the other person to agree with your version of events in order for that version to be true. For a long time, truth may have felt like something that only existed once it was validated by someone else, once they nodded, once they admitted it, once they finally said the words you'd been waiting years to hear. That's a heavy way to live, outsourcing the most basic function of your own mind to someone who has repeatedly shown you they can't be trusted with it. Letting that requirement go quietly, deciding that your own clear memory of your own life is enough with or without anyone else's agreement, tends to feel less like a small adjustment and more like finally exhaling after holding your breath for years without realizing it. The moment you start trusting it again is the moment the whole pattern begins to lose its power over you. Not because you outsmarted anyone, but because you finally stopped needing their permission to believe your own life.